Hello, everyone. Welcome to our YouTube channel. I'm Omar Al-Nidawi, and I'm joined today by Erik Gustafson, our Executive Director here at Enabling Peace in Iraq Center. Over the past few weeks, we've seen major upheaval around U.S. foreign assistance, especially with talk of shutting down USAID and freezing almost all of foreign aid. There have been a lot of strong statements coming from the President, from his Secretary of State, and from Elon Musk. Today, we're going to share some of those statements, discuss the facts behind them, and break down why all this matters to Americans and also to our partners around the globe, including in Iraq.
Thank you so much, Omar. It's really good to join you. I'm burning the midnight oil over here in East Africa. But no, it's really important to join you right now and talk about this. I want to jump into it. Let's talk about some of these statements that have been made by senior officials to also address some of the misunderstandings about USAID and about foreign aid. And I should just add, I just got off a Zoom call with the State Department. There was Director Peter Morocco kicked things off. He's the director of the Office of Foreign Assistance for the State Department. And apparently he is also the author of the order that froze foreign assistance aid. So he had opened it. It was supposed to be a listening session. I think about 1,000 people, mostly from the humanitarian community and international development folks and various organizations, farmers associations, the Coffee Association and others were part of that call, but very, very interesting. So in the course of the interview, I'll also try to share some insights that I got from some of the participants in that listening session.
That's amazing. Yeah, I would love to hear about that. But first, let's take a look at some of the recent statements that were made by Elon Musk.
USAID has been one of your main targets. Are you concerned at all that some of the cuts or that shutting that agency altogether may lead to diseases or other bigger problems starting in other countries that then come to the United States?
Yeah, so that's an interesting example. So that's something where we work closely with the State Department and Secretary Rubio. And we have, for example, turned on funding for Ebola prevention and for HIV prevention.
You left that, you said?
Yes, correct. And we are moving fast, so we will make mistakes, but we'll also fix the mistakes very quickly.
Erik, what does that mean for humanitarian aid?
What we're hearing is, I think, a philosophy that works in the tech sector, disruption, move fast, break things. But when we're talking about vital life-saving programs, an agency working in 160 countries around the world, in various sectors, global health, in education, in emergency humanitarian assistance, responding to natural disasters, sudden sweeping freezes disrupts that work. And you have a disruption of supply chains in sometimes sensitive areas like into the Democratic Republic of Congo. You have a disruption that means that you lay off local health staff. So even programs that we've been told would not be disrupted would have a humanitarian exemption like PEPFAR. That's the president's initiative on AIDS relief. You literally have clinics for people who have been waiting in lines. What this means is a disruption of life-saving programs. Even though U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reportedly scrambled to grant these humanitarian exemptions to reinstate aid programs, for example, containing Ebola in Uganda or preventing HIV with PEPFAR, once you break those supply chains and dismiss local health workers, it can't be fixed overnight. Also, this week, we learned from testimony in the federal court that no such waiver system, there's humanitarian exemptions, that no such waiver system yet exists, and that USAID's online payment system has not been functioning for weeks. This means that hundreds of these life-saving programs, from food aid to fighting tuberculosis, remain stalled. Also, in that 30-minute press event that you just played a clip from, I think what's interesting is, I think Elon Musk, I think everybody arguably understands, recognizes he's a smart guy. But what's notable is that he's clearly not an international development expert. He doesn't necessarily have the kind of deep knowledge in the many different sectors and the, over 100 countries that USAID operates in just the course of that 30-minute press event, he contradicted himself, saying HIV prevention efforts would continue while at the same time questioning the cost of delivering condoms to clinics in Mozambique. Well, I mean, that's vital in terms of preventing the spread of a sexually transmitted disease. And then also the other thing to keep in mind is that sometimes I think he's getting these cherry-picked details without the context. So, are we talking about the cost of the delivery of the condoms, or is it also about the distribution? Is it about the staff, the training, the HIV prevention work happening at those clinics? There's this cognitive bias known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. You can be the smartest guy in the room, and it can still affect you because nobody is an expert on everything. And even a visionary leader like Elon Musk must realize that they're not an expert on these complex international development programs. USAID has decades of institutional memory and expertise that needs to be drawn from, especially if you're going to conduct a review and then carry out reforms. It's encouraging, though, that Mr. Musk acknowledges that he and his team have made mistakes and that those mistakes should be fixed. I think the first step, though, is restoring the people, the programs, the expertise, the infrastructure of USAID. Only then, I think, can you really legitimately carry out the kind of rethinking of those programs and to find ways where the development assistance that we're providing throughout the world is more effective and is serving US interests in terms of making Americans safer, more prosperous, and stronger.
That is quite concerning. Let's listen to another segment from that same press conference.
It's a worthy cause, USAID.
I think that there's some worthy things, but overall, if you say what was the bang for the buck, I would say it was not very good. And there was far too much of what USAID was doing was influencing elections in ways that I think were dubious and do not stand the light of day.
How would you like to respond to this, Erik?
Okay, so he's talking about bang for the buck. Well, foreign assistance is incredibly cost effective, less than 1% of the federal budget. That's a small investment that has helped lift over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty since 1990 and reduce by half infant, child, and maternal mortality worldwide. In terms of meddling in elections, I mean, USAID is legally barred. These are statutory requirements, and with congressional oversight and with Inspector General right there in-house and audits and everything, USAID is legally barred from partisan interference in elections. This is mostly about ensuring the conduct of free and fair elections, having an even playing field for all parties who compete for those offices. Anti-corruption efforts, good governance, exactly the kind of work that creates more stability and benefits US interests in the long run. I mean, just imagine fighting corruption in a country. That's very helpful for private companies that are doing business, where we are a trade partner with that country. Now, does that mean that foreign governments don't complain? Of course not. Of course, you're going to have complaints from foreign governments. But I want to just give you a quick insight. As you know, I'm a veteran of the US Army. I served a number of years. Then for years, ever since, I've always been focused on Iraq since the 90s. I've made many, many trips to Iraq. I've observed 2 elections that have taken place on the ground, both of which were the elections in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And I can tell you, just as an example of the work that USAID does, I observed elections as an international observer. I would come and sit in, where the elections were happening, all within the protocols, all legitimate. And sitting next to me would be the representatives of sometimes 3 different civil society organizations. Some of those civil society organizations might have been closer to some of the ruling political parties. Some of them might have been aligned more with some of the opposition parties, and some of them were completely independent. And they were there taking notes, making sure that there were no irregularities, and ensuring that it was a free and fair election. And then their reports were important in terms of the Iraqi people having confidence that the elections had been conducted in a free and fair manner. That's not meddling with an election. That's helping ensure that the elections are carried out and that they're free and fair, and that they then carry the legitimacy. The results carry the legitimacy and respect of the public, of the wider public, of the voters.
Oh, wow. Thanks for sharing that insight, Erik. And amazing statistics that you mentioned about what USAID has done in terms of lifting people out of poverty and reducing child mortality. Let's move on to another theme. And again, at the same press conference that we showed parts of it earlier, at that same event, President Trump declared that, quote, USAID is really corrupt. I can't imagine a judge saying you don't have the right to check if things are right or honest, unquote. Erik, nobody's saying you can't review programs, correct?
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. I mean, yesterday, a federal judge found no justification for a blanket freeze and set a 5-day deadline for the Trump administration to comply with lifting its USAID funding freeze and barring Secretary of State Marco Rubio and other Trump officials from enforcing the stop work orders. I mean, this is a gift, you can say a Valentine's Day gift for the American people, for people around the world. Critically important to be able to restore these programs as quickly as possible. In a way, it's like if you had concerns about maybe some hospital staff following protocols, would you shut down the emergency room for every hospital across the country? Just imagine for a minute what that would be like. Whether your child is in a car accident and needs immediate emergency care, you have an aging parent who has a medical emergency, your wife goes into premature labor, and the emergency rooms are closed. That's effectively what we have done to these programs that are addressing humanitarian emergencies around the world and providing critical support in preventing the spread of disease and so many other critical efforts. In terms of corruption, I hear this idea of fraud and corruption, and we'll speak a little bit more about that in the course of this interview. USAID is the most monitored, scrutinized, overseen, and audited federal agency in Washington, D.C. You have the General Accounting Office. You have the Inspector General in-house for USAID. You have congressional oversight. So it's very bizarre that an agency that's been around since 1961 with tremendous bipartisan support suddenly is a pariah. No, it didn't happen overnight. I think this has been a hit. I think this has been an effort to somehow justify eliminating an agency in the federal bureaucracy. It doesn't have much to do in terms of USAID, in terms of the history of the agency. There's just no evidence of widespread fraud or corruption. And when it comes to some of these very specific programs that the Trump administration, President Trump himself, has issues with, like DEI programs, diversity, diversity,
equity and inclusion.
I forget what. Yes, thank you. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or LGBTI rights. Those are the kinds of things that any new administration can make changes on. That's why a new administration will appoint someone to head the agency, and then you begin to make changes in terms of the programs. You don't have to shut down the whole agency for that. And the vast majority of the programming, I'd say over 90%, has nothing to do with those kinds of programs.
Yeah, and you mentioned the theme of fraud and or claims of fraud and corruption, and I want to go to another statement that President Trump made the other day. He was on board Air Force One on February 10. He said, USAID deals are, quote, fake, unquote, and, quote, fraudulent, unquote, with just a few legitimate ones that could be run by Secretary Rubio at State. Do you think there are grounds for such broad claims of widespread fraud that's engulfed USAID?
It's bizarre that you hear these talking points being made. Okay, so where are the prosecutions, right? Because when you talk about something like waste, fraud, and abuse, these are things that you hold people accountable for. And by the way, if you are an implementing partner for USAID and you are caught with an issue of a serious issue of fraud, waste, and abuse, you have to return every single dollar back to the agency. That's the standard. That's what you have to do. So also, I think there's some confusion. So let me just break it down because sometimes these words are thrown around and used synonymously, but they are quite different. Waste is the careless spending or improper use of government money, which can include incurring unnecessary expenses or mismanaging resources or property, like taking a joyride in a Black Hawk helicopter, for example. Fraud is the wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. If you knowingly deceive the federal government about a direct conflict of interest, that's deceptive. That could potentially fall under the category of fraud. Abuse is the intentional, wrongful, or improper use or destruction of government resources or seriously improper practices. So those are accountable. There are requirements that have to be met. Our organization, Epic, we have been a subawardee under USAID twice, once through a great organization, IOM. We did the great project I Love Sinjar. Folks can still see the results of that project. When we did that, just as a subawardee, there were onerous requirements in terms of finance, reporting, compliance with various requirements. That's what you have to face. You have to account for every single dollar spent and make sure that it's spent under, as regulated by USAID. There's something else that keeps coming up and keeps being grouped in that same category, broad category, and that's alignment with the president's agenda. That's a little different. Alignment with the president's agenda is an entirely different issue, and it normally gets addressed when a president appoints somebody to head the agency. It's a little strange that they're bringing up alignment as an issue when, tell me, when did President Trump assume office? Wasn't that just January 20th? So that seems a bit odd. And then last, I just want to point out that when we talk about this, it's not just work that's being done in foreign countries. Aid is not just money. We're not just giving this money to foreign governments and foreign agencies. Aid is also about goods and services. And a lot of those goods and services are American. You have US-based organizations. EPIC is a US-based organization. You have much larger US-based organizations like International Rescue Committee and Mercy Corps and others. You have goods like agricultural goods. Billions of aid dollars actually supports US farmers, businesses, and nonprofits. And this idea of kickbacks, it's just unsupported by data. I'm sorry. I mean, show us the evidence. There's just no data that supports that claim.
Yeah, indeed. But let's look at some of the other claims that are being raised about what the kind of work that USAID supports in other countries. The other day, White House Press Secretary Carolyn Levitt, she said on February 5th that there are a, quote, long list of federal waste, unquote, in the programs that the USAID funds, in other countries, including, quote, a $20 million being spent on a new Sesame Street show in Iraq, unquote. So she implies that these are prime examples of USAID's, again, quote, insane priorities, unquote. What do you think, Erik, of this? How do you respond to this argument?
Look, I would love to invite Ms. Levitt to join us for visits to IDP camps, refugee camps, to meet with the children, to meet with the families, talk with the parents. I think that she has no idea. Let me just talk about that fact sheet, which I feel like is really very misleading. There's not a whole lot of facts on that sheet. Several of the programs that she listed were not even USAID programs. They were actually State Department projects. And then let me just give you one example. So, because one that I know about directly, the $20 million Sesame Street in Iraq program. Okay, so first of all, that is for 6 years, so many seasons of that program. It is now known as Ahlan Simsim. There's a great history to it. Originally there had been another program that had been around for many, many years. It was the first international co-production of Sesame Street overseas. I think the production studio was out of Kuwait City, and it was hugely loved across the region. We know by research that Sesame Street does get results in terms of education and helping kids learn how to handle emotions and things like that, pro-social behaviors. So that program actually ended up being shut down because, well, your country invaded Kuwait, as you'll recall. And so ever since the 91 Gulf War, that program has been off the air, other than maybe reruns in some countries. So Ahlan Simsim was bringing back that production. And the $20 million, again, for 6 years, that was only one contribution. The Lego Foundation made a contribution. The MacArthur Foundation made a $100 million contribution. And this was a children's educational program to reach conflict-affected kids across the Middle East, including kids whose education had been disrupted because of the civil war in Syria, because of conflict and ongoing displacement in Iraq. And it was serving not just kids in Iraq, but again, across the region. That's only one small program. $20 million is a very small portion of the overall $40 billion budget that the agency had, I think, for last year. So that's just a small portion. It doesn't, again, represent the more than 90% of core programs providing food, vaccines, water, education, clearing minefields so kids don't blow up, and so on. Now, let me speak a little bit briefly about some of the Iraq-specific work that I'm aware of that USAID does. Clearing explosive hazards. Iraq is one of the most heavily mined countries in the world. At least 1,100 square miles of territory are contaminated with explosive hazards, resulting in more than 10,000 deaths and some 24,000 injuries over the past 2 decades, according to researchers. Now, USAID, working with other countries, keep in mind that USAID is among the largest donors for demining efforts around the world. But USAID contributed to an effort that cleared over 100 square miles of minefields and of unexploded ordnances. And they've done that since 2003. So again, that's a percentage of a larger number, but it still moves the ball down the field in terms of clearing these fields so that farmers can begin to once again cultivate their fields. I mean, keep in mind that some of the clearance of minefields happened after ISIS occupied the territory. It also, of course, helps people to return to their homes in places like Sinjar. There's been the effort to help Yazidis and Christians and other minorities recover from the genocide that ISIS carried out against those communities. That has been an ongoing effort to help these communities recover, rebuild, and provide trauma recovery for survivors. And, you and I, we've been intimately involved with some of these projects, and we've actually met some of the beneficiaries. We've worked with some of these local organizations in places like Sinjar, and we know that the difference that they're making in their communities. And again, working in 160 countries, hundreds of programs, including life-saving programs, all of which needs to be fully restored, funded, and being able to continue to carry out the important work that they carry out.
Yeah, indeed, real work addressing real problems. This reminds me what you mentioned about explosive remnants of war. Just this week, we were, as we were preparing our Iraq newsletter for the week, there were two explosions of remnants of war in Basra, killed 4 people and injured 7, 5 of whom were children. So these are acute problems that are impacting millions of Iraqis. Basra is Iraq's second largest province. But it seems that decision makers in Washington think that USAID's investments are not really paying off. On February 4th, Secretary Rubio argued that, quote, in some cases with USAID, 10, 12, 13%, maybe less of the money was actually reaching the recipient, and the rest was going into overhead and bureaucracy, unquote. Is this an accurate assessment of how money is spent through USAID programs?
That's misleading. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has actually been a staunch supporter of USAID for the 14 years he was in Congress, he knows better. He knows how these things work. He's, I'm sure, read the reports, reviewed the audits. I'm sure that he's always had issues. There's always going to be a little bit of difference between how Republicans want to see USAID operate and how Democrats want to see USAID operate. But like just to set the record straight, I think he might be referring to the percentage of funds going directly to local entities, local partners in these various countries. And that percentage, that he might be correct on that percentage. But that doesn't mean that the entire rest of it is wasted overhead. A large part of the funds goes to NGOs. It goes to Catholic Relief Services. It goes to UN international organizations like the World Food Program to implement those programs on the ground. And also, as I said earlier, it also goes to farmers buying goods that are then delivered to war-torn Sudan or, IDPs, refugees in Iraq and in the Middle East. I know that there's a congressional service report, there's an analysis that found that 7.7% is truly administrative costs. So that's your overhead. The rest of it is to run those programs effectively around the world.
That's actually very low.
Again, you and I know what it's like as a subawardee for a USAID program where we had to keep our administrative costs that low. What ended up happening is that we actually had to cover some of those overhead costs ourselves.
Agreed. I remember that. Okay, so here's another accusation. Again, going back to Secretary Rubio, on February 4th, he said that USAID is basically, quote unquote, a global charity, adding that it basically doesn't align with U.S. national interest and that it undermines the work of ambassadors, in his words. Is that your perception of how it works? Does USAID actually coordinate with the State Department?
Yeah, absolutely. By design, USAID takes policy direction from the Secretary of State, but it remains independent so that it can focus on development, longer term work with civil society, with local governments, with businesses. Diplomacy, which is the realm of foreign policy and diplomacy for the State Department itself, that's usually focused much more on short-term immediate benefits, that first order impact, and deals primarily with national governments. We need both. In fact, talk to anybody in the armed forces. I remember when I was in the northeast province of Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, and we ourselves on the defense side, we were involved in building prisoner of war camps. Prisoner of war camps. Well, what ended up happening, as you know this history all too well, having lived through it. When you had the uprising, popular uprising, many governorates across the region rising up against the government of Saddam Hussein, the Saddam Hussein regime. Then there was a brutal crackdown. And, we didn't intervene. The United States, the international community didn't intervene. That's a whole nother story. But as a result, you had a mass exodus. You had Kurds freezing to death on the borders of Turkey and Iran. You had a huge flow of Iraqi refugees into the northeast province of Saudi Arabia, which of course freaked Saudi Arabia out because the northeast province is majority Shia, and of course many of the those who were fleeing were Iraqi Shia, and so You had agencies like USAID come in and they took what had been a prisoner of war camp and converted it into a refugee camp to be able to provide protection, because the idea of then sending all of these refugees back to Iraq, that could be their death sentence. That's an example. But what the military will tell you is that you need development, you need diplomacy, and you need defense. Each requires specialized expertise. And the idea that you're going to then take development, which is more about like longer term impacts, that more the second order impact, that you're going to merge it with the State Department diplomacy, which is more about first order impact, that doesn't make sense. And you also run the risk of politicizing humanitarian work. Some of the best work that USAID does is based on humanitarian principles. And they're able to do that work so effectively because they abide by those humanitarian principles. And, merge it with state, and then the risk of politicizing that effort.
But yet, the president seems to think that USAID is redundant. He said the other day that there's no reason for USAID since, quote, we can just put the good programs through the State Department, unquote. So you seem to think that there's value in having an independent USAID that's separate from the State Department, and they think that this is the best in the best interest of U.S. strategic interests.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it absolutely needs to stay separate and independent, because when you talk about international development, these are very complex programs. You have it in the health, education, agriculture. These programs can span years and require in-depth expertise. My biggest fear right now is with what's going on, demoralizing so many of these longtime international workers. You have international development workers. I think the workforce for USAID, the direct staff, was around 10,000. You can imagine thousands of them have deep expertise. They have advanced degrees. They know maybe it's in virology, public health, and you're losing some of that talent right now. That's a real danger. The idea that you're going to then bring all of that expertise that's looking at the long game into the State Department and be able to preserve the same quality of work, I think is just highly questionable. Historically, we do have a recent precedent of what happens when you merge development with diplomacy. And that's with in the UK, they folded DFID, which is the Department for International Development, into the Foreign Office. In 2023, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact said that the UK's capacity to support international development has decreased, citing the loss of DFID expertise on managing complex emergencies and the decline in transparency of aid spending. So again, you politicize some of this work, maybe there's going to be less transparency. But if it's based on humanitarian principles, it's very easy to be very transparent about what you're carrying out. Regarding USAID, if we want strong oversight, accountability, and impact, we need a dedicated agency with a clear development mandate, and it needs to remain independent.
Let's talk specifics. Tell me more about what are the real world impacts that we are going to see because of these cuts that are happening. Some critics say the freeze of foreign aid is going to hurt local communities abroad, of course, while supporters argue that some of the countries actually resent USAID presence, that they don't like us, they don't want us to be there in the first place. So what is actually happening on the ground? What is the impact of these recent policy changes?
Well, I mean, I can tell you, and maybe I have the paper here. Let's see. Yeah, so this is the front page news this week in Nairobi, Kenya. You also, of course, have doctors going on strike because they're not being paid, probably directly related to the aid freeze. It has an impact. The United States, USAID, is the world's largest funder for some of these humanitarian programs. Sometimes it's as much as 50% of the humanitarian assistance going into a country is coming from USAID. There are immediate impacts. So, for example, USAID carries out programming that tracks the bird flu in 49 countries. including outbreaks that could reach the United States. There's the funding for the eradication programs for polio, tuberculosis, malaria, and tropical diseases, and preventing those epidemics. I should mention also with tuberculosis, this is very serious, and it's very hard to diagnose when children are affected by tuberculosis. So a lot of the deaths from tuberculosis are among children. And being able to train the public health sector in these various countries and in the clinic at the local level to be able to properly diagnose this and then treat tuberculosis. I mean, that saves lives, and those lives will be lost by the disruption of that program. There's also the FUSNet, which is the gold standard for famine monitoring around the world. I know it's in place in places like Ethiopia, and that has gone offline with the freeze, which is leaving humanitarian groups flying blind right now in terms of identifying where to direct resources to meet those most in need. There's, of course, fear that I hope there's not a major natural disaster that occurs right now, because the ability to quickly respond to those natural disasters, being able to establish quickly the supply chains, get the food and medical supplies to those affected. Economic growth, again, big problem. And by the way, just as a quick example, look up Power Africa. Power Africa was a program that has been hugely important in terms of electrifying Africa. And with that program like that, US-based energy companies have been benefiting from that. And that being offline, who do you think is going to step in and take over that role in electrifying Africa?
China?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's vaccines for mothers and infants. There's also programs that can directly affect Americans, like, very immediately. And that is training law enforcement in Mexico and Colombia to counter narcotics, especially fentanyl. Having fentanyl cross into our border, that's very serious. It's deadly. Just 2 grains of like the equivalent of 2 grains of salt of fentanyl can kill you. And then of course there's the education sector, things like helping to support secret schools for Afghan girls have been effectively shut down, or at least aren't being funded right now. Will sometimes some of these efforts upset a foreign government? Sure. I think schools for Afghan girls will probably upset the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Does that mean we don't do it? I think you also have to recognize this is a component of U.S. policy, advancing U.S. interests, and our values as a country. So, in short, it's not just one place or one program. There's a global ripple effect that is costing lives and damaging U.S. interests right now in real time.
Indeed, it has been a global debate, really. And we've seen some surprising endorsements. And again, it's a debate on both sides. We've seen surprising endorsements for dismantling USAID. People like Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former president, he called it a smart move. Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary celebrated it as an end to the globalist funding. We also saw a statement from El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, who slammed U.S. aid as being funneled into opposition groups. Here at home, Mike Benz, an appointee during the first Trump administration, strongly promoted by Elon Musk, has been making the rounds, parroting similar claims. How should we understand those voices that are attacking U.S. aid?
It's no coincidence that authoritarian leaders and alt-right figures share the same talking points. For people like Medvedev or Orban, weakening an institution that supports civil society and accountable governance is a victory. Of course, they love that. President Bukele, who has taken strong man tactics, resents foreign funding of investigative journalism or human rights defenders, which can expose, of course, corruption and abuse. So he frames aid as meddling. I think, again, this is why you want it separate. You want the diplomacy that works with the national government. You want the development that can work with civil society as well. And then, of course, you have the defense side for national security and the military to military cooperation. Mike Benz, who is also known as, I should say, Frame Game, he's a former Trump appointee. His alt-right alias, Frame Game, is known for racist conspiracy theories and blaming Jews for all that's wrong in America. And now apparently he's America's top expert on foreign aid, despite zero professional background in international development. Internet research doesn't grant you expertise in international development. It's a field requiring thousands of trained professionals in deep sector knowledge like health, agriculture, or disaster responses. Unfortunately, these unqualified voices are being promoted on platforms like X, and they're promoting an unlawful stop work order that effectively guts an agency designed to save lives and advance U.S. interests worldwide. There are other real-world consequences to this. Efficiency improvements are fine. I think everybody can get on board with that. But dismantling USAID based on the endorsements of foreign strongmen and the alt-right, I mean, that's nuts. It puts millions of lives at risk. It undermines US leadership and credibility around the world. And the question to ask is, who benefits the most from such reckless action?
Yeah, it is very concerning, of course. And to talk more about some of the impact on the ground, we're seeing reports that $500 million worth of food that's going for to aid those in need is rotting in ports right now. Is that happening?
Yeah, that's according to an Inspector General report. USAID buys from, as I mentioned earlier, US farmers. They buy wheat, soybeans, sorghum, peas. This helps feed vulnerable populations while supporting US agriculture. If that spoils in these ports and in these ships without ever being delivered, nobody benefits. Not the people facing conflict or famine who need it the most, not the US farmers who produced it, and not American taxpayers. It's also hitting organizations around the world, including nonprofits. I mean, Norwegian Refugee Council calls it the worst cutoff in 79 years. So let's just take this one major and very important organization. We, of course, know the great work that NRC has done on the ground in Iraq. We remember when Basra had the huge water crisis, their reports were amazing. And they supported so much of the work of other organizations and civil society organizations. They have had to suspend programs in 20 countries affecting hundreds of thousands of people. And I believe that includes, for example, people in war-torn Sudan and in Bangladesh, and the list goes on. I hope that everyone who has watched us, I know it's been a long program, but I hope everybody who stayed with us can appreciate that when it comes to US foreign assistance and US aid, it's about making Americans stronger, safer, and more prosperous. It's about addressing threats before they reach our borders or cross our borders. It's hugely important for our national security. It's a component that everybody recognizes, diplomacy, development, and defense. And right now, that three-legged stool, we've kicked out one of the legs, and it needs to be restored as quickly as possible.
Wow. Erik, thank you for this incredibly informative and insightful conversation. The stakes are clearly huge, not just for the people overseas who depend on aid, but also for our economy here in the United States, for our security, and for United States global leadership role. So thank you so much for all of this.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. I mean, we hope this sheds light on why these cuts matter. That foreign aid is less than 1% of our federal budget, yet it delivers massive returns in terms of health security, economic growth, and global stability. And if you're concerned, I hope please take the time to call your elected officials, call your senators, call your representative, call the White House, call the State Department. Ask them to pursue lawful oversight, not a reckless shutdown of an agency that has saved millions of lives and has helped keep us strong, safe, and prosperous. So thank you so much. You can see the resources in the description down below, a great question and answer resource, as well as details to help support your calls to Congress. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erik. And thank you all for watching. If you found this conversation informative, please like, share, and subscribe. And let's stay informed and let's keep this conversation going in the comment section. Until next time, take care.